Global politics explores the nature of politics beyond the state and how power, conflict, and cooperation operate on a global scale. This exam covers the major challenges facing the world today, such as terrorism, poverty, economic instability, environmental degradation, weapons proliferation, and failing states, and considers why these issues often require international and global cooperation to address them. Global politics develops international awareness and an understanding of multiple perspectives, encouraging debate and the evaluation of competing and contestable claims. The state and globalization interact where states both shape and are shaped by global economic, political, and social processes that influence their power, decision-making, and ability to address global issues. The state is a political entity with a defined territory, a permanent population, a system of government, and the authority to make and enforce laws. A nation-state is a political community bound together by shared citizenship and nationality, where the state and the nation largely coincide. The characteristics of a nation-state are a defined territory, a permanent population, a single system of government, national identity, and the capacity to enter relations with other states. An example of a nation-state is Japan, where a shared national identity broadly aligns with the boundaries of the state. National sovereignty is the state's absolute power over citizens and subjects, allowing it to govern without external interference. The characteristics of national sovereignty are supreme legal authority, control over internal affairs, independence from other states, and the ability to make and enforce laws within its territory. An example of national sovereignty is the United Kingdom Parliament passing legislation following Brexit, demonstrating its authority to make laws independently of the European Union. Globalization is the increasing interconnectedness of people, states, economies, cultures, and institutions across the world. The process of globalization is the way economic, political, social, and technological links deepen over time, making states and societies more interdependent. An example that shows this process is the global distribution of COVID-19 vaccines between 2020 and 2022 through international cooperation between states, pharmaceutical companies, and global institutions. The factors that drive globalization are the interlinking of people socially, countries politically, institutions legally, culture, economics, technology, and politics. The social factor of globalization is the increased movement and communication of people across borders, shown by the growth of international social media use such as TikTok connecting users worldwide since 2019. The political factor of globalization is cooperation between states to address shared problems, shown by the Paris Climate Agreement continuing to guide coordinated climate policy during the 2020s. The institutional factor of globalization is the growing influence of international organizations over state behavior, shown by the World Health Organization coordinating global pandemic responses during COVID-19. The cultural factor of globalization is the spread of ideas, values, and lifestyles across borders, shown by the worldwide popularity of Korean popular culture through music and television during the last decade. The economic factor of globalization is the integration of national economies through trade and investment, shown by global supply chain disruptions after the 2021 Suez Canal blockage affecting states worldwide. The technological factor of globalization is the rapid spread of digital technology that enables instant global communication, shown by the expansion of remote working platforms during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. The political economy factor of globalization is the influence of global markets and multinational corporations on state decision-making, shown by governments adjusting tax policies in response to international corporate pressure during the 2010s and 2020s. The impact of globalization on the state system is the widening and deepening of interconnectedness, challenges to state control over citizens, the development of international law, increased humanitarian and forcible intervention, and debate between hyperglobalizers, skeptics, and transformationalists from realist and liberal perspectives. The impact of widening and deepening interconnectedness is that states become increasingly dependent on one another, shown by global energy price rises after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The impact of challenges to state control over citizens is that states face limits on authority in areas such as law, shown by the European Court of Human Rights influencing domestic legal decisions during the last decade. The impact on the development of international law is the growth of shared legal standards across states, shown by international climate law shaping national environmental policies since the Paris Agreement. The impact of humanitarian and forcible intervention is that states justify intervention beyond their borders on moral or security grounds, shown by international military and humanitarian involvement in Ukraine since 2022. The impact of the debate between hyperglobalizers, skeptics, and transformationalists is disagreement over whether globalization weakens or reshapes the state, shown by contrasting realist and liberal interpretations of state responses to global crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic. The impact of globalization is the increased interconnectedness and interdependence of states, economies, societies, and cultures across the world. The advantages of globalization are economic growth, cultural exchange, technological advancement, and international cooperation. The advantage of economic growth is that global trade and investment create jobs and wealth, shown by the expansion of global e-commerce companies such as Amazon increasing employment across multiple countries during the last decade. The advantage of cultural exchange is that ideas and lifestyles spread across borders, shown by the global popularity of Korean music and television influencing youth culture worldwide since the mid-2010s. The advantage of technological advancement is that innovation spreads rapidly between states, shown by the global use of video conferencing technology during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. The advantage of international cooperation is that states can address shared problems collectively, shown by coordinated global vaccine development and distribution during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the disadvantages of globalization are economic inequality, loss of local industries, cultural homogenization, and reduced state control. The disadvantage of economic inequality is that wealth becomes unevenly distributed between and within states, shown by growing income gaps in many countries following global economic integration during the last decade. The disadvantage of loss of local industries is that domestic businesses struggle to compete with multinational corporations, shown by the decline of traditional high street retailers in the UK due to global online competition. The disadvantage of cultural homogenization is that local cultures can be overshadowed by dominant global cultures, shown by the global spread of Western fast food chains replacing traditional diets in many countries. The disadvantage of reduced state control is that governments face pressure from global markets and institutions, shown by states limiting public spending in response to international financial market expectations during recent economic crises. The implications of globalization for the nation-state are reduced autonomy, increased cooperation, and adaptation of domestic policy to global pressures. The implication of reduced autonomy is that nation-states must share decision-making with international organizations, shown by states following World Health Organization guidance during the COVID-19 pandemic. The implication of increased cooperation is that states work together more closely on global issues, shown by joint international sanctions imposed on Russia following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The implication of policy adaptation is that governments adjust domestic laws to remain competitive, shown by states reforming corporate tax rules in response to global minimum tax agreements in the early 2020s. The implications of globalization on national sovereignty are limits on absolute state power, shared authority, and legal constraints from international law. The implication of limits on absolute state power is that states cannot act entirely independently, shown by trade rules enforced through the World Trade Organization affecting national economic policy. The implication of shared authority is that decision-making is divided between national and international levels, shown by European states coordinating energy policy in response to recent supply crises. The implication of legal constraints is that international law shapes domestic law, shown by national climate legislation reflecting commitments made under international climate agreements during the last decade. Globalization addresses and resolves contemporary issues such as poverty, conflict, human rights, and the environment in many ways. Globalization addresses poverty by increasing economic integration, foreign investment, and access to global markets that can create jobs and raise incomes. Globalization resolves poverty to a greater extent as international trade and development initiatives allow poorer states to benefit from global supply chains and aid. This is shown by Vietnam's continued reduction in extreme poverty since 2020 through export-led growth in manufacturing and technology sectors. However, globalization may address poverty to a lesser extent as economic benefits are often unevenly distributed within states. This is shown by rising living costs and food insecurity in many developing countries following global inflation and supply chain disruptions after the COVID-19 pandemic. Globalization addresses conflict by promoting economic interdependence and diplomatic cooperation between states. Globalization resolves conflict to a greater extent as shared economic and political interests can discourage states from engaging in war. This is shown by coordinated international sanctions and diplomatic efforts aimed at deterring further escalation following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. However, globalization may address conflict to a lesser extent as global economic and political ties can also intensify tensions and competition. This is shown by ongoing conflicts where global energy and resource dependence has failed to prevent warfare, such as the continued fighting in Ukraine since 2022. Globalization addresses human rights issues by spreading international norms, scrutiny, and pressure through global institutions and media. Globalization resolves human rights issues to a greater extent as international cooperation and reporting mechanisms can hold states accountable. This is shown by international investigations and sanctions responding to alleged human rights abuses in Xinjiang highlighted by global organizations since 2021. However, globalization may address human rights issues to a lesser extent as states can prioritize economic interests over rights protection. This is shown by continued global trade with states accused of human rights violations despite widespread international criticism over the last 5 years. Globalization addresses the environment by encouraging collective action and shared responsibility for global environmental problems. Globalization resolves environmental issues to a greater extent as international agreements promote coordinated environmental protection. This is shown by states strengthening climate commitments and cooperation following recent United Nations climate conferences since 2021. However, globalization may address environmental issues to a lesser extent as increased global trade and production can raise pollution levels. This is shown by rising global carbon emissions linked to post-pandemic economic recovery and increased international shipping since 2021. Global governance operates on political and economic levels where states, international organizations, and non-state actors cooperate to manage conflict, development, human rights, and global economic stability. Global governance occurs at a political level as states cooperate through international organizations to manage shared problems such as conflict, security, development, and human rights. Global governance is done political through the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The United Nations is an international organization that brings together almost all states to promote peace, security, cooperation, and the protection of human rights. The origins of the United Nations is the aftermath of the Second World War, where states sought to prevent future global conflict following the failure of the League of Nations. The development of the United Nations is marked by gradual expansion in membership, responsibilities, and peacekeeping activities as global politics has become more complex. In the first stage of development, the United Nations focused on maintaining international peace and security through collective security and diplomacy after 1945. In the second stage of development, the United Nations expanded peacekeeping and humanitarian roles during the Cold War to manage regional conflicts without direct superpower confrontation. In the third stage of development, the United Nations widened its agenda after the Cold War to include human rights, development, climate change, and global health. The role of the United Nations is to maintain international peace and security, encourage cooperation, and act as a forum for resolving disputes between states. The strengths of the United Nations are its near-universal membership, its role as a forum for diplomacy, and its ability to promote international cooperation on peace, security, development, and human rights. However, the weaknesses are its reliance on state cooperation, limited enforcement powers, and political divisions between major powers that can restrict effective action. The United Nations contains the Security Council, General Assembly, Economic and Social Council, and the International Court of Justice, each with distinct but connected functions. The Security Council is the body responsible for maintaining international peace and security through binding resolutions, sanctions, and the authorization of force. The Security Council is significant to a greater extent as it can pass legally binding resolutions, which is shown in sanctions and arms embargo decisions relating to conflicts such as those involving North Korea in the early 2020s. However, it may be significant to a lesser extent as veto power can block action, which is shown in repeated vetoes preventing Unified Security Council responses to the conflict in Ukraine since 2022. The strengths of the Security Council are its legal authority, enforcement powers, and ability to act quickly in serious international crises. However, the weaknesses are the veto power of the permanent 5 members and the lack of equally representative decision-making. The General Assembly is the main deliberative body where all member states can debate issues and pass resolutions on global concerns. The General Assembly is significant to a greater extent as it represents global opinion, which is shown in large majority votes condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine since 2022. However, it may be significant to a lesser extent as its resolutions are not legally binding, which is shown in states continuing disputed actions despite repeated General Assembly condemnations in recent years. The strengths of the General Assembly are universal membership, democratic debate, and agenda setting on global issues. However, the weaknesses are the lack of enforcement powers and the limited impact of non-binding resolutions. The Economic and Social Council is the body responsible for coordinating international economic, social, and development activities within the United Nations system. The Economic and Social Council is significant to a greater extent as it oversees progress on global development goals, which is shown in recent reviews of the Sustainable Development Goals after the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it may be significant to a lesser extent as it relies on cooperation rather than enforcement, which is shown in uneven progress on poverty reduction and inequality since 2020. The strengths of the Economic and Social Council are coordination of specialized agencies and a focus on long-term development issues. However, the weaknesses are limited authority and dependence on state commitment and funding. The International Court of Justice is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations that settles legal disputes between states and gives advisory opinions. The International Court of Justice is significant to a greater extent as it can clarify international law, which is shown in provisional measures ordered in cases relating to armed conflict and humanitarian obligations since 2022. However, it may be significant to a lesser extent as it depends on state consent, which is shown in some states rejecting or ignoring judgments in recent disputes. The strengths of the International Court of Justice are legal expertise, independence, and contribution to the development of international law. However, the weaknesses are the lack of enforcement mechanisms and reliance on voluntary compliance. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a military alliance of North American and European states committed to collective defense. The role of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is to deter aggression, defend member states, and promote security cooperation. The role of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has changed since the end of the Cold War as it has expanded membership and taken on crisis management and deterrence roles beyond its original purpose. This is shown in increased NATO support for Ukraine and the accession of Finland in 2023 and Sweden in 2024 following heightened security concerns in Europe. The strengths of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization are collective defense under Article 5, military capability, and strong political unity among members. However, the weaknesses are reliance on US leadership, unequal burden sharing, and the risk of escalating tensions with non-member states. Global governance occurs at an economic level as states cooperate to manage trade, finance, development, and economic stability across borders. Global governance is done economically through the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, G7, G8, and G20. The International Monetary Fund is an international financial institution that supports global monetary cooperation and financial stability. The role of the International Monetary Fund is to provide financial assistance, policy advice, and surveillance to help states manage economic crises. The International Monetary Fund is significant to a greater extent as it provides emergency financial support. This is shown in large-scale lending programs to countries such as Sri Lanka following its debt crisis in 2022. However, it may be significant to a lesser extent as its loan conditions can worsen social hardship. This is shown in public protests against IMF-backed austerity measures in countries like Pakistan since 2022. The strengths of the International Monetary Fund are rapid access to finance, economic expertise, and influence over global financial stability. However, the weaknesses are strict conditionality, perceived bias towards wealthier states, and limited democratic accountability. The World Bank is an international development institution that provides loans and grants to reduce poverty and support long-term development. The role of the World Bank is to fund development projects, improve infrastructure, and promote economic growth in lower-income countries. the World Bank is significant to a greater extent as it supports development investment. This is shown in increased funding for health, education, and climate resilience projects after the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it may be significant to a lesser extent as projects can increase debt. This is shown in concerns over rising debt burdens in African states supported by World Bank lending since 2020. The strengths of the World Bank are access to long-term finance, technical expertise, and focus on poverty reduction. However, the weaknesses are slow project delivery, debt dependency, and criticism over project effectiveness. The World Trade Organization is an international organization that regulates global trade rules between states. The role of the World Trade Organization is to promote free trade, resolve disputes, and reduce trade barriers. The World Trade Organization is significant to a greater extent as it provides a framework for trade cooperation. This is shown in continued negotiations on fisheries subsidies aimed at supporting sustainable development since 2021. However, it may be significant to a lesser extent as its dispute system has been weakened. This is shown in the ongoing paralysis of the appellate body since the early 2020s. The strengths of the World Trade Organization are clear trade rules, dispute resolution mechanisms, and promotion of trade liberalization. However, the weaknesses are slow decision-making, inequality between developed and developing states, and limited enforcement capacity. The G7, G8, and G20 are informal groups of major economies that meet to discuss global economic and financial issues. The roles of the G7, G8, and G20 are to coordinate economic policy, respond to crises, and provide political leadership on global challenges. The G7, G8, and G20 are significant to a greater extent as they can respond quickly to crises. This is shown in coordinated economic responses to inflation and energy shocks following the war in Ukraine since 2022. However, they may be significant to a lesser extent as they exclude many poorer states. This is shown in criticism from developing countries over limited representation at recent G20 summits. The strengths of the G7, G8, and G20 are flexibility, speed of decision-making, and influence over the global economy. However, the weaknesses are lack of formal accountability, limited inclusivity, and non-binding decisions. Global economic governance is significant to a greater extent at dealing the issue of poverty as it mobilizes resources and coordinates development efforts across states. This is shown in increased multilateral funding for poverty reduction and social protection programs following the economic impacts of COVID-19 since 2020. However, it may be significant to a lesser extent as global inequality persists despite governance efforts. This is shown in rising poverty levels in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia following inflation and debt crises since 2021. The North-South divide refers to the economic and developmental gap between wealthier developed states and poorer developing states. The North-South divide is significant in dealing with poverty as it highlights structural inequality, which is shown in international debt relief and aid initiatives targeted at low-income countries since 2020. The North-South divide is not significant to a full extent as emerging economies such as China and India have reduced poverty despite remaining outside the traditional global north in recent years. World systems theory and dependency theory explain global poverty by arguing that poorer states are structurally exploited by wealthier core states within the global economic system. World systems theory and dependency theory are significant in dealing with poverty as they highlight unequal trade and resource extraction, which is shown in continued reliance of many African and Latin American states on raw material exports to richer economies since 2020. World systems theory and dependency theory are not significant to a full extent as some peripheral states have reduced poverty through integration into global markets, which is shown in Vietnam and Bangladesh increasing manufacturing exports and employment in the early 2020s. Orthodox measurements of poverty focus on income-based indicators such as absolute poverty lines and gross domestic product per capita. Orthodox measurements of poverty are significant in dealing with poverty as they allow governments and international organizations to target aid, which is shown in World Bank and IMF poverty reduction programs guided by income data since 2020. Orthodox measurements of poverty are not significant to a full extent as they fail to capture quality of life, which is shown in countries with rising GDP still experiencing poor health and education outcomes after the COVID-19 pandemic. Alternative measurements of poverty focus on broader indicators such as health, education, and living standards rather than income alone. Alternative measurements of poverty are significant in dealing with poverty as they provide a fuller understanding of deprivation, which is shown in increased use of the Multidimensional Poverty Index by governments and the United Nations since 2020. Alternative measurements of poverty are not significant to a full extent as they can be complex and harder to apply consistently, which is shown in uneven adoption and reporting of multidimensional poverty data across developing states in recent years. Classical economic development theory argues that development follows a linear path of growth driven by industrialization and investment. Classical economic development theory is significant in dealing with poverty as growth-led strategies have reduced poverty, which is shown in post-pandemic economic recovery policies in several Asian economies. Classical economic development theory is not significant to a full extent as growth has not always reduced inequality, which is shown in widening income gaps within fast-growing economies since 2020. Structural theory argues that global economic structures disadvantage developing states through unequal trade and dependence. Structural theory is significant in dealing with poverty as it explains persistent underdevelopment, which is shown in continued reliance on primary exports in African economies since 2021. Structural theory is not significant to a full extent as some states have diversified successfully, which is shown in Vietnam expanding manufacturing and reducing poverty in the early 2020s. Neoclassical development theory focuses on free markets, limited state intervention, and efficiency. Neoclassical development theory is significant in dealing with poverty as market reforms can attract investment, which is shown in foreign direct investment growth in parts of Southeast Asia since 2021. Neoclassical development theory is not significant to a full extent as market liberalization can increase inequality, which is shown in social unrest linked to rising living costs in developing states since 2022. The United Nations, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank and the World Trade Organization all address contemporary global issues, such as conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment. The United Nations addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as it provides peacekeeping, diplomacy, and humanitarian coordination, which is shown in United Nations-led humanitarian assistance and mediation efforts during the ongoing Ukraine war since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as major power disagreement limits action, which is shown in the United Nations Security Council failing to pass unified resolutions on Gaza due to divisions among permanent members since 2023. The United Nations addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as it coordinates international development goals and aid, which is shown in United Nations agencies supporting recovery and poverty reduction programs following the economic impacts of COVID-19 since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as implementation depends on state cooperation and funding, which is shown in rising poverty levels in parts of sub-Saharan Africa despite ongoing United Nations initiatives since 2021. The United Nations addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as it monitors abuses and sets international standards, which is shown in United Nations investigations into human rights violations in Ukraine and Myanmar since 2021. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as enforcement mechanisms are weak, which is shown in continued human rights abuses in Xinjiang despite repeated United Nations criticism since 2020. The United Nations addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as it coordinates global climate action, which is shown in United Nations-led climate negotiations and commitments made at COP26 and COP28 since 2021. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as agreements are non-binding, which is shown in states missing emissions reduction targets despite United Nations climate framework since 2020. The membership structure may prevent the United Nations Security Council from effectively addressing these issues as permanent members hold disproportionate power, which is shown in Russia retaining its seat and influence despite being a party to the Ukraine conflict since 2022. The use of the veto may prevent the United Nations Security Council from effectively addressing these issues as single states can block action, which is shown in repeated Russian and United States vetoes on resolutions relating to Ukraine and Gaza since 2022. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as it provides collective defense and deterrence, which is shown in NATO strengthening its eastern flank and supporting Ukraine following the Russian invasion since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it cannot intervene without consensus, which is shown in NATO avoiding direct military involvement in Ukraine to prevent escalation since 2022. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as it contributes indirectly through stability and security, which is shown in NATO support missions that protect aid delivery routes in conflict-affected regions in the early 2020s. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as poverty reduction is not its primary role, which is shown in limited NATO involvement in addressing global cost of living crisis since 2021. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as it promotes democratic values among members, which is shown in continued pressure on member states to uphold democratic standards during recent enlargement decisions since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as strategic priorities can override human rights concerns, which is shown in ongoing cooperation with states criticized for rights issues due to security needs since 2020. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as it recognizes climate change as a security threat, which is shown in NATO commitments to reduce military emissions and address climate risks in its 2022 strategic concept. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as military activity contributes to environmental damage, which is shown in concerns over the environmental impact of increased military exercises in Europe since 2022. The International Monetary Fund addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as it stabilizes economies affected by conflict, which is shown in emergency financial support provided to Ukraine following the Russian invasion since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it does not have a security mandate, which is shown in its inability to prevent or stop ongoing armed conflicts such as the war in Gaza since 2023. The International Monetary Fund addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as it provides financial assistance to prevent economic collapse, which is shown in IMF bailout programs aimed at stabilizing Sri Lanka during its 2022 debt crisis. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as austerity conditions can increase hardship, which is shown in protests and rising living costs linked to IMF programs in Pakistan since 2022. The International Monetary Fund addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as economic stability can support social protection spending, which is shown in IMF advice encouraging protection of vulnerable groups during post-pandemic recovery since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as conditionality can undermine social rights, which is shown in cuts to public services following IMF-backed reforms in several developing states since 2021. The International Monetary Fund addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as it integrates climate risks into economic policy advice, which is shown in the creation of climate-related lending facilities in the early 2020s. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as economic growth priorities can outweigh environmental protection, which is shown in continued fossil fuel subsidies in IMF-supported economies since 2020. The pressure for reform may prevent the International Monetary Fund from effectively addressing these issues as disagreements over voting power limit change, which is shown in ongoing calls from developing states for governance reform since 2021. The structural adjustments programs may prevent the International Monetary Fund from effectively addressing these issues as austerity measures can deepen inequality, which is shown in rising poverty and unrest following reform programs in countries such as Ghana since 2022. The global economic crisis may prevent the International Monetary Fund from effectively addressing these issues as demand for support exceeds resources, which is shown in the surge of IMF lending requests following inflation and debt crises since 2021. The World Bank addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as it supports post-conflict reconstruction, which is shown in funding for rebuilding infrastructure in Ukraine since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as insecurity can limit project delivery, which is shown in delays to development projects in conflict-affected regions such as Yemen since 2020. The World Bank addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as it finances long-term development projects, which is shown in increased investment in health and education programs after the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as loans can increase debt, which is shown in growing debt burdens among African states receiving World Bank support since 2021. The World Bank addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as it promotes inclusive development, which is shown in projects aimed at improving access to education for girls since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as economic priorities can override rights concerns, which is shown in criticism of World Bank projects linked to displacement of local communities in recent years. The World Bank addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as it funds climate resilience and green energy projects, which is shown in increased climate finance commitments since 2021. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as some projects have environmental impacts, which is shown in opposition to large infrastructure schemes funded by the bank since 2020. The pressure for reform may prevent the World Bank from effectively addressing these issues as governance structures favor wealthier states, which is shown in continued calls for voting reform from developing countries since 2021. The structural adjustments programs may prevent the World Bank from effectively addressing these issues as policy conditions can reduce social spending, which is shown in criticism of adjustment-linked reforms in low-income states since 2020. The global economic crisis may prevent the World Bank from effectively addressing these issues as rising demand strains resources, which is shown in increased borrowing needs following global inflation and debt shocks since 2021. The World Trade Organization addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as trade cooperation can reduce economic tensions between states, which is shown in continued WTO-led negotiations to keep global supply chains open following disruptions caused by the Ukraine war since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it has no security or enforcement role in conflicts, which is shown in its inability to prevent trade disruption caused by sanctions and war-related trade bans since 2022. The World Trade Organization addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as free trade can promote economic growth and employment, which is shown in developing states benefiting from preferential trade arrangements maintained through the WTO framework since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as unequal trade rules can disadvantage poorer states, which is shown in continued criticism from developing countries over agricultural subsidies in richer states in recent WTO talks. The World Trade Organization addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as trade rules can encourage labor standards through international pressure, which is shown in recent debates linking trade and forced labor concerns since 2021. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as human rights are not central to its mandate, which is shown in ongoing trade with states accused of serious human rights abuses since 2020. The World Trade Organization addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as it supports sustainable trade initiatives, which is shown in agreements on reducing harmful fisheries subsidies reached since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as trade liberalization can increase environmental damage, which is shown in rising global emissions linked to increased production and trade since 2020. The G7, G8, and G20 addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as they coordinate political and economic responses among major powers, which is shown in joint G7 and G20 statements and sanctions responses following the invasion of Ukraine since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as divisions between members limit consensus, which is shown in disagreement within the G20 over references to the Ukraine war in summit communiques since 2022. The G7, G8, and G20 addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as they mobilize financial support and debt relief, which is shown in G20 agreements on debt service suspension for poorer countries after the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as commitments are non-binding, which is shown in slow progress on debt relief for low-income countries since 2021. The G7, G8, and G20 addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as members promote shared democratic values, which is shown in G7 condemnations of human rights abuses in authoritarian states since 2021. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as strategic interests can override rights concerns, which is shown in continued economic engagement with states accused of rights violations in recent years. The G7, G8, and G20 addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as they coordinate climate and energy policies, which is shown in G7 commitments to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as members have differing priorities, which is shown in limited agreement on binding climate targets at recent G20 summits. The global civil society is the network of non-governmental organizations, charities, pressure groups, social movements, and activists that operate across borders. The role of the global civil society in addressing and resolving global issues is to raise awareness, influence governments and international organizations, and deliver support where states are unwilling or unable to act. The global civil society addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as it provides humanitarian aid and advocacy, which is shown in organizations such as the Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières delivering aid during the Ukraine war since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it lacks enforcement power, which is shown in global civil society campaigns failing to bring an end to the conflict in Gaza since 2023. The global civil society addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as charities and campaign groups provide direct support and pressure governments, which is shown in international food and poverty relief programs expanded after the COVID-19 pandemic since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it relies on donations and political will, which is shown in funding shortages affecting humanitarian responses in the Horn of Africa since 2021. The global civil society addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as it monitors abuses and campaigns for accountability, which is shown in Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reporting on abuses in Ukraine and Iran since 2021. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as authoritarian states can ignore or suppress criticism, which is shown in the continued detention of activists despite global civil society pressure in countries such as Myanmar since 2021. The global civil society addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as it mobilizes public opinion and influences policy, which is shown in global climate protests linked to movements such as Fridays for Future since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it cannot force governments to act, which is shown in rising global emissions despite sustained environmental campaigning since 2020. Non-state actors are organizations and groups that influence global politics but are not national governments, including multinational corporations, terrorist groups, charities, and pressure groups. The role of non-state actors in addressing and resolving global issues is to shape outcomes through economic power, advocacy, service delivery, or, in some cases, violence. The non-state actors addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as humanitarian organizations and mediators can reduce suffering, which is shown in non-governmental organizations facilitating aid access in Ukraine since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as some non-state actors intensify conflict, which is shown in armed groups prolonging violence in regions such as Gaza since 2023. The non-state actors addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as charities and corporations invest in development and employment, which is shown in private sector and NGO-led poverty relief initiatives during post-pandemic recovery since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as profit-driven actors can worsen inequality, which is shown in criticism of multinational corporations benefiting from low wages in developing states since 2021. The non-state actors addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as advocacy groups expose abuses and pressure states, which is shown in campaigns supporting women's rights in Iran since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as corporations and armed groups can violate rights, which is shown in allegations of labor exploitation in global supply chains in recent years. The non-state actors addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as environmental organizations and firms promote sustainability, which is shown in corporate net zero commitments and NGO-led conservation projects since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as some non-state actors contribute to environmental harm, which is shown in continued deforestation and pollution linked to private companies despite environmental pledges since 2021. Non-governmental organizations are independent, non-profit organizations that operate nationally and internationally to address social, political, and humanitarian issues. The role of non-governmental organizations in addressing and resolving global issues is to provide direct aid, raise awareness, influence policy, and hold governments and institutions to account. The non-governmental organizations addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as they deliver humanitarian aid and medical assistance in war zones, which is shown in organizations such as Médecins Sans Frontières and the Red Cross operating in Ukraine since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as they lack the power to end violence, which is shown in ongoing conflict in Gaza despite sustained humanitarian and advocacy efforts since 2023. The non-governmental organizations addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as they provide food, healthcare, and development support, which is shown in NGO-led famine relief and poverty reduction programs expanded after COVID-19 since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as funding shortages limit impact, which is shown in reduced aid provision during the cost of living crisis affecting charities since 2021. The non-governmental organizations addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as they monitor abuses and campaign for accountability, which is shown in Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reporting on violations in Iran and Ukraine since 2021. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as states can ignore criticism, which is shown in continued repression of opposition groups despite NGO reporting in Myanmar since 2021. The non-governmental organizations addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as they mobilize public pressure and promote conservation, which is shown in NGO involvement in climate campaigns and biodiversity protection linked to global climate summits since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as they cannot enforce environmental change, which is shown in rising global emissions despite sustained environmental activism since 2020. Global governance at a human rights and environmental level involves the cooperation of states, international organizations, and non-state actors to protect fundamental rights and manage environmental challenges across national boundaries. Human rights are governed globally by a framework of international law, treaties, customary norms, and institutions designed to protect individuals from abuse by states. The international institutions that govern human rights are the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, special UN tribunals, and the European Court of Human Rights. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a foundational international document that sets out universal civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides these institutions with a source of authority as it establishes shared global standards that later treaties and courts interpret and enforce. Humanitarian interventions are actions taken by states or international bodies to prevent or stop serious human rights abuses such as genocide or crimes against humanity. These institutions lead to humanitarian interventions as their legal findings legitimize international pressure or action where states fail to protect their populations. Selective interventionism is the inconsistent application of humanitarian intervention depending on political, strategic, or economic interests. These institutions lead to selective interventionism as their rulings rely on state cooperation, meaning enforcement occurs unevenly. Western double standards are the perception that Western states apply human rights rules strictly to others but loosely to themselves or allies. These institutions lead to Western double standards as enforcement often targets weaker states while powerful Western actors avoid accountability. The International Court of Justice is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations that settles legal disputes between states. The origins of the International Court of Justice is its establishment in 1945 as the successor to the Permanent Court of International Justice. The development of the International Court of Justice is marked by its increasing role in human rights-related disputes between states. The first stage of development was its creation to resolve interstate disputes peacefully after the Second World War. The second stage of development was the expansion of its jurisdiction to include advisory opinions on human rights matters. The third stage of development is its modern role addressing genocide, war crimes, and state responsibility cases. The sources of authority for the International Court of Justice are the UN Charter, international treaties, customary international law, and general principles of law. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides the International Court of Justice with a source of authority by informing interpretations of human rights obligations under binding treaties. The key issues of the International Court of Justice dealing with human rights are genocide, use of force, and state responsibility. The issue of genocide is addressed where the court assesses whether states breach the Genocide Convention, as seen in South Africa bringing a case against Israel in 2024. The issue of use of force is addressed where the court examines unlawful military action, as shown in Ukraine v. Russia following the 2022 invasion. The issue of state responsibility is addressed where states are held accountable for systemic abuses, as demonstrated by provisional measures ordered against Myanmar in relation to the Rohingya crisis. The International Court of Justice impacts state sovereignty as it limits absolute state autonomy by imposing binding legal obligations. An example of this is Russia being ordered to suspend military operations in Ukraine in 2022. The International Court of Justice has led to humanitarian interventions as its rulings justify international diplomatic and humanitarian pressure. An example of successful humanitarian interventions from the International Court of Justice is increased international aid and monitoring following provisional measures in the Myanmar case. An example of unsuccessful humanitarian interventions from the International Court of Justice is the continuation of violence in Gaza despite provisional measures ordered in 2024. The International Court of Justice has led to selective interventionism as enforcement depends on political will rather than automatic compliance. This has led to the development of responsibility to protect and conflict with state sovereignty as states are expected to act where courts identify mass atrocities. An example of selective interventions from the International Court of Justice is strong enforcement pressure against Russia but limited action against allied states. The International Court of Justice has led to Western double standards as Western-backed states face fewer consequences for non-compliance. An example of this is limited enforcement against Israel following the 2024 Provisional Measures case. The International Criminal Court is a permanent international court that prosecutes individuals for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The origins of the International Criminal Court is the Rome Statute agreed in 1998 and entering into force in 2002. The development of the International Criminal Court is characterized by expanding investigations into global conflicts. The first stage of development was the establishment of jurisdiction over the most serious international crimes. The second stage of development was early prosecutions focusing mainly on African states. The third stage of development is its recent expansion into cases involving major powers and global conflicts. The sources of authority for the International Criminal Court are the Rome Statute and referrals from the UN Security Council. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides the International Criminal Court with a source of authority by defining the fundamental rights that international crimes violate. The key issues of the International Criminal Court dealing with human rights are individual criminal accountability and enforcement. The issue of accountability is shown by the arrest warrant issued for Vladimir Putin in 2023 for alleged war crimes in Ukraine. The issue of enforcement is highlighted by difficulties arresting suspects, as seen in Sudan where warrants remain unenforced. The International Criminal Court impacts state sovereignty as it asserts jurisdiction over individuals regardless of state consent in some cases. An example of this is the ICC seeking arrest warrants for Israeli leaders in 2024. The International Criminal Court has led to humanitarian interventions as prosecutions deter future abuses and encourage international action. An example of successful humanitarian interventions from the International Criminal Court is increased international pressure following prosecutions linked to Darfur. An example of unsuccessful humanitarian interventions from the International Criminal Court is ongoing conflict in Ukraine despite arrest warrants. The International Criminal Court has led to selective interventionism as some powerful states remain outside its jurisdiction. This has led to the development of responsibility to protect and conflict with state sovereignty as states resist external criminal oversight. An example of selective interventions from the International Criminal Court is the lack of cases against U.S. nationals. The International Criminal Court has led to Western double standards as Western states support prosecutions abroad while rejecting ICC authority domestically. An example of this is the United States refusing ICC jurisdiction while supporting cases against rivals. Special UN tribunals are temporary courts established to prosecute serious violations of international humanitarian law. The origins of UN tribunals are post-conflict responses to mass atrocities authorized by the UN Security Council. The development of UN tribunals is marked by their shift from ad hoc courts to hybrid and investigative mechanisms. The first stage of development was the creation of tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The second stage of development involved hybrid courts combining domestic and international law. The third stage of development is investigative mechanisms such as the UN Syria mechanism. The sources of authority for UN tribunals are UN Security Council resolutions and international humanitarian law. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides UN tribunals with a source of authority by defining rights violated during mass atrocities. The key issues of the UN tribunals dealing with human rights are accountability and post-conflict justice. The issue of accountability is shown by convictions at the Kosovo Specialist Chambers in 2023. The issue of post-conflict justice is demonstrated by ongoing investigations into crimes committed in Syria. UN tribunals impact state sovereignty as they override domestic legal systems to prosecute individuals. An example of this is Kosovo cooperating with international prosecutors despite political resistance. UN tribunals has led to humanitarian interventions as findings support international sanctions and aid responses. An example of successful humanitarian interventions from UN tribunals is increased international engagement following Kosovo war crimes prosecutions. An example of unsuccessful humanitarian interventions from the UN tribunals is continued violence in Syria despite UN investigations. UN tribunals has led to selective interventionism as they are created only where Security Council consensus exists. This has led to the development of responsibility to protect and conflict with state sovereignty as intervention depends on political agreement. An example of selective interventions from UN tribunals is the absence of a tribunal for Yemen. UN tribunals has led to Western double standards as Western allies avoid tribunal creation. An example of this is the lack of a UN tribunal addressing alleged abuses by coalition forces in Yemen. The European Court of Human Rights is a regional court that enforces the European Convention on Human Rights. The origins of the European Court of Human Rights is the establishment of the Convention in 1950. The development of the European Court of Human Rights is marked by expanding jurisdiction over member states. The first stage of development was its role as an optional complaints body. The second stage of development was compulsory jurisdiction for member states. The third stage of development is its modern role addressing systemic human rights violations. The sources of authority for the European Court of Human Rights are the European Convention on Human Rights and member state consent. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides the European Court of Human Rights with a source of authority by influencing the Convention's rights framework. The key issues of the European Court of Human Rights dealing with human rights are political imprisonment, fair trials, and state violence. The issue of political imprisonment is shown in rulings against Turkey over the detention of Osman Kavala. The issue of fair trials is demonstrated by judgments against Russia prior to its expulsion in 2022. The issue of state violence is shown by cases concerning police brutality in Eastern Europe. The European Court of Human Rights impacts state sovereignty as it requires states to amend laws following adverse judgments. An example of this is the UK being required to review prisoner voting restrictions. The European Court of Human Rights has led to humanitarian interventions as its judgments prompt legal and humanitarian reforms. An example of successful humanitarian interventions from the European Court of Human Rights is reforms to detention conditions following adverse rulings. An example of unsuccessful humanitarian interventions from the European Court of Human Rights is Russia ignoring judgments prior to leaving the Council of Europe. The European Court of Human Rights has led to selective interventionism as only European states fall under its jurisdiction. This has led to the development of responsibility to protect and conflict with state sovereignty as regional enforcement challenges national autonomy. An example of selective interventions from the European Court of Human Rights is the inability to act outside Europe. The European Court of Human Rights has led to Western double standards as non-European abuses fall outside scrutiny. An example of this is the court's inability to address human rights violations in US-led military operations outside Europe. The environment is governed globally by international agreements, scientific cooperation, and institutions that coordinate state responses to environmental harm. The environment is governed globally by the United Nations Framework Convention and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The United Nations Framework Convention is an international treaty framework that brings states together to address climate change through cooperation and negotiation. The role of the United Nations Framework Convention is to provide a platform where states agree targets, share responsibility, and develop collective responses to climate change. The United Nations Framework Convention is significant to a greater extent as it enables binding agreements that commit states to action on emissions reduction. This is shown by the Paris Agreement being implemented and reaffirmed through summits such as COP26 in 2021 and COP28 in 2023. However, the United Nations Framework Convention may be significant to a lesser extent as it lacks strong enforcement mechanisms to compel state compliance. This is shown by many states failing to meet their emissions targets despite commitments made under the Paris Agreement since 2015. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a UN body that assesses scientific evidence on climate change rather than creating binding law. The role of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is to provide authoritative scientific reports that inform governments and international negotiations. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is significant to a greater extent as its findings shape global policy and justify urgent climate action. This is shown by the Sixth Assessment Report released between 2021 and 2023 influencing national climate strategies and COP negotiations. However, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change may be significant to a lesser extent as it has no power to enforce action on states. This is shown by continued global emissions growth despite repeated scientific warnings highlighted in recent IPCC reports. The International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, UN Tribunals, European Court of Human Rights, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change all address contemporary global issues, such as conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment. The International Court of Justice addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as it provides legal rulings and provisional measures that clarify state responsibilities, which is shown in Ukraine v. Russia where the court ordered Russia to suspend military operations in 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it lacks enforcement power, which is shown in Russia continuing military action despite the court's ruling. The International Court of Justice addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as it clarifies state obligations that indirectly affect economic conditions, which is shown in advisory opinions influencing reparations and development linked to decolonization cases such as Chagos in 2019 continuing to shape outcomes after 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as poverty is not its primary jurisdiction, which is shown by limited direct impact on global inequality despite legal rulings. The International Court of Justice addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as it interprets international conventions protecting populations, which is shown in provisional measures ordered in the South Africa v. Israel genocide case in 2024. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as compliance is voluntary, which is shown by ongoing humanitarian concerns despite the court's measures. The International Court of Justice addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as it clarifies environmental obligations under international law, which is shown by its 2023 agreement to deliver an advisory opinion on climate change obligations requested by the UN General Assembly. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as advisory opinions are not binding, which is shown by continued global environmental harm despite legal clarification efforts. State sovereignty may prevent the International Court of Justice from effectively addressing these issues as states can ignore rulings, which is shown by Russia rejecting the court's authority after 2022. The extent to which international law is accepted and enforced may prevent the International Court of Justice from effectively addressing these issues as compliance depends on political will, which is shown by Israel disputing the binding nature of provisional measures in 2024. The performance of international courts may prevent the International Court of Justice from effectively addressing these issues as cases are lengthy and slow, which is shown by years-long delays in genocide and territorial disputes. The controversies surrounding international courts may prevent the International Court of Justice from effectively addressing these issues, as accusations of bias undermine legitimacy, which is shown by criticism from powerful states following rulings related to Ukraine and Gaza. The International Criminal Court addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as it prosecutes individuals responsible for war crimes, which is shown by arrest warrants issued for Russian officials including Vladimir Putin in 2023. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it relies on state cooperation, which is shown by the inability to arrest suspects linked to the Ukraine conflict. The International Criminal Court addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as accountability for exploitation and conflict-related crimes can reduce long-term instability, which is shown by investigations into resource-driven violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo continuing after 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as poverty is an indirect concern, which is shown by limited improvement in living conditions despite prosecutions. The International Criminal Court addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as it holds individuals criminally responsible for abuses, which is shown by arrest warrants linked to crimes against humanity in Gaza issued in 2024. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as enforcement is weak, which is shown by suspects remaining at large. The International Criminal Court addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as it increasingly recognizes environmental destruction as a war crime, which is shown by prosecutors emphasizing environmental harm in recent conflict investigations. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as environmental crimes are not explicitly defined, which is shown by the absence of conviction solely for environmental damage. State sovereignty may prevent the International Criminal Court from effectively addressing these issues as non-member states reject its authority, which is shown by Russia and the United States refusing cooperation. The extent to which international law is accepted and enforced may prevent the International Criminal Court from effectively addressing these issues as arrest warrants are ignored, which is shown by Sudan failing to surrender suspects over the past decade. The performance of international courts may prevent the International Criminal Court from effectively addressing these issues as cases progress slowly, which is shown by long-running investigations without verdicts. The controversies surrounding international courts may prevent the International Criminal Court from effectively addressing these issues as claims of Western bias reduce legitimacy, which is shown by African states criticizing the court's focus on certain regions. UN tribunals address and resolve global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as they prosecute individuals responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity, which is shown in convictions delivered by the Kosovo Specialist Chambers between 2020 and 2023. However, they may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as they rely on state cooperation for arrests, which is shown in the continued failure to prosecute senior figures responsible for crimes in Syria despite ongoing UN investigations. UN tribunals address and resolve global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as accountability for conflict-related crimes can support post-conflict stability and development, which is shown in UN-backed justice processes in the Central African Republic continuing since 2021. However, they may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as poverty is an indirect concern of criminal justice, which is shown by persistent poverty in conflict states despite tribunal activity. UN tribunals address and resolve global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as they investigate and document mass abuses, which is shown by the UN Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar expanding evidence collection since 2020. However, they may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as findings do not always lead to prosecutions, which is shown by limited legal consequences for perpetrators in Myanmar. UN tribunals address and resolve global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as they increasingly document environmental destruction linked to conflict, which is shown by UN investigations into environmental damage during the Ukraine war from 2022 onwards. However, they may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as environmental harm is not a core crime, which is shown by the absence of direct prosecutions for environmental destruction alone. State sovereignty may prevent UN tribunals from effectively addressing these issues as states can refuse cooperation, which is shown by Syria blocking international judicial processes since 2015. The extent to which international law is accepted and enforced may prevent UN tribunals from effectively addressing these issues as enforcement depends on political will, which is shown by repeated Security Council deadlock over accountability mechanisms. The performance of international courts may prevent UN tribunals from effectively addressing these issues as proceedings are slow and complex, which is shown by long-running investigations with few final convictions. The controversies surrounding international courts may prevent UN tribunals from effectively addressing these issues as accusations of bias undermine legitimacy, which is shown by criticism from states targeted by UN investigations. The European Court of Human Rights addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as it adjudicates interstate cases arising from war, which is shown in judgments concerning Russia's actions in Ukraine delivered between 2022 and 2024. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it lacks enforcement power, which is shown by Russia ignoring judgments prior to its withdrawal from the court in 2022. The European Court of Human Rights addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as it protects social and economic rights under the Convention, which is shown in cases requiring states to improve welfare provision since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it cannot compel economic redistribution, which is shown by ongoing poverty across Europe despite adverse rulings. The European Court of Human Rights addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as it delivers binding judgments against member states, which is shown by rulings against Turkey on unlawful detention between 2020 and 2023. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as compliance varies, which is shown by delayed implementation of judgments by several states. The European Court of Human Rights addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as it recognizes environmental harm as a human rights issue, which is shown in the Klimasynerinen v. Switzerland judgment in 2024. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as its jurisdiction is limited to convention rights, which is shown by the dismissal of broader climate claims brought by young activists in 2024. State sovereignty may prevent the European Court of Human Rights from effectively addressing these issues as states can withdraw or resist compliance, which is shown by Russia leaving the Council of Europe in 2022. The extent to which international law is accepted and enforced may prevent the European Court of Human Rights from effectively addressing these issues as enforcement relies on domestic implementation, which is shown by slow compliance with rulings across Eastern Europe. The performance of international courts may prevent the European Court of Human Rights from effectively addressing these issues as case backlogs delay justice, which is shown by lengthy waiting times for judgment since 2019. The controversies surrounding international courts may prevent the European Court of Human Rights from effectively addressing these issues as political criticism undermines authority, which is shown by repeated challenges to the court's legitimacy by national governments. The United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as it promotes cooperation over climate-related security risks, which is shown in climate security being formally debated at COP26 in 2021 following links between climate stress and conflict. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it lacks authority over armed actors, which is shown in ongoing conflicts linked to climate pressures in the Sahel continuing despite UN climate initiatives since 2020. The United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as it supports climate finance and adaptation for vulnerable states, which is shown in the expansion of climate finance commitments reaffirmed at COP27 in 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as funding pledges are often unmet, which is shown in developed states failing to fully deliver the $100 billion annual climate finance goal by 2023. The United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as it increasingly recognizes climate change as a threat to livelihoods and health, which is shown in the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27 in 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as human rights protections are indirect, which is shown by continued displacement of communities despite climate agreements since 2020. The United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as it coordinates global emissions reduction efforts, which is shown in states submitting updated nationally determined contributions following COP26 in 2021. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as commitments are voluntary, which is shown by global emissions continuing to rise after COP28 in 2023. Shallow green ecology is an approach that prioritizes environmental protection within existing economic systems, whereas deep green ecology is an approach that calls for fundamental changes to human lifestyles and values. The competing views of shallow green ecology and deep green ecology may prevent the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change from effectively addressing these issues as states favor economic growth over radical change, which is shown in resistance to fossil fuel phase-out at COP28 in 2023. Sustainable development is the pursuit of economic growth alongside environmental protection, whereas the tragedy of the commons is the overuse of shared resources due to individual self-interest. The competing views of sustainable development and the tragedy of the commons may prevent the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change from effectively addressing these issues as states prioritize national growth over collective restraint, which is shown in continued deforestation and emissions growth since 2015. The strengths of international agreements on global environmental governance are cooperation, shared standards, and long-term goal setting. These may help the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change address issues involving conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment as collective action supports stability and adaptation, which is shown in coordinated climate responses following extreme weather events since 2020. However, the weaknesses of international agreements on global environmental governance are weak enforcement and reliance on voluntary compliance. These may prevent the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change address issues involving conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment as states can ignore commitments, which is shown by missed emissions targets under the Paris Agreement by many states by 2023. The key international agreements among Rio, Kyoto, Copenhagen, Paris on global environmental governance are frameworks that establish principles, targets, and cooperation mechanisms. These may help the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change address issues involving conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment as the Paris Agreement provides a common global framework, which is shown in near universal participation since 2016. However, these may prevent the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change address issues involving conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment as earlier agreements lacked binding enforcement, which is shown by the failure of Kyoto targets to prevent long-term emissions growth. Sovereignty is an obstacle to international cooperation as states prioritize national interests, and may prevent the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change from effectively addressing these issues as states resist external pressure, which is shown in countries' weakening commitments at COP meetings since 2018. The World Division of Developed and Developing Nations is an obstacle to international cooperation as states disagree over responsibility and resources, and may prevent the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change from effectively addressing these issues as negotiations stall, which is shown in disputes over climate finance at COP26 and COP27. The disagreement over responsibility and measurement is conflict over who should act and how emissions are counted, and may prevent the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change from effectively addressing these issues as trust is undermined, which is shown in ongoing disputes over emissions reporting and fairness since 2015. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as it identifies climate change as a risk multiplier for instability, which is shown in the 6th Assessment Report published between 2021 and 2023 linking climate stress to conflict in regions such as the Sahel. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it has no policy-making or enforcement power, which is shown in continued climate-related conflicts despite IPCC warnings since 2021. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as it highlights how climate impacts disproportionately affect poorer communities, which is shown in its 2022 report emphasizing risks to food security and livelihoods in developing states. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it cannot compel wealth redistribution or adaptation funding, which is shown by persistent poverty despite repeated IPCC recommendations since 2020. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as it frames climate change as a threat to life, health, and housing, which is shown in recent IPCC reports being cited in climate litigation and UN human rights debates since 2021. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it does not directly enforce rights protections, which is shown by ongoing displacement from climate impacts despite scientific evidence. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as it provides the most authoritative global scientific assessment of environmental change, which is shown by the widespread use of the Sixth Assessment Report in national climate policies after 2021. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as states can ignore its findings, which is shown by rising global emissions despite clear scientific warnings since 2021. The competing views of shallow green ecology and deep green ecology may prevent the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from effectively addressing these issues as governments favor moderate reforms over systemic change, which is shown by resistance to rapid fossil fuel phase-out following IPCC warnings since 2018. The competing views of sustainable development and the tragedy of the commons may prevent the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from effectively addressing these issues as states pursue individual economic growth, which is shown by continued overuse of shared atmospheric resources despite global targets. The strengths of international agreements on global environmental governance are shared scientific knowledge, cooperation, and long-term goal setting. These may help the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change address issues involving conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment as its evidence informs coordinated global responses, which is shown by IPCC findings shaping negotiations at COP26 and COP27. However, the weaknesses of international agreements on global environmental governance are weak enforcement and voluntary compliance. These may prevent the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change address issues involving conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment as states can disregard scientific advice, which is shown by failure to meet emissions reduction pathways outlined by the IPCC. The key international agreements among Rio, Kyoto, Copenhagen, Paris on global environmental governance are frameworks that translate scientific evidence into political commitments. These may help the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change address issues involving conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment as the Paris Agreement aligns closely with IPCC temperature targets, which is shown by governments referencing IPCC carbon budgets since 2018. However, these may prevent the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change address issues involving conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment as compromises weaken ambition, which is shown by insufficient national pledges to meet IPCC recommended limits by 2023. Sovereignty is an obstacle to international cooperation as states control their own policies, and may prevent the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from effectively addressing these issues as governments reject external pressure, which is shown by some states criticizing or downplaying IPCC findings since 2018. The world division of developed and developing nations is an obstacle to international cooperation as states disagree over responsibility and capacity, and may prevent the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from effectively addressing these issues as negotiation stall, which is shown by disputes over adaptation finance following IPCC reports. The disagreement over responsibility and measurement is conflict over who should reduce emissions and how they are calculated, and may prevent the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from effectively addressing these issues as trust is undermined, which is shown by ongoing debates over historical emissions and reporting standards since 2015. The global civil society addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as non-governmental organizations provide humanitarian aid and raise awareness, which is shown in international NGOs supporting civilians affected by the Ukraine war since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it lacks enforcement power, which is shown in continued fighting in Ukraine despite widespread civil society condemnation. The global civil society addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as charities and advocacy groups deliver aid and influence policy, which is shown in organizations such as Oxfam expanding food security programs during the global cost of living crisis since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as it relies on voluntary funding, which is shown in aid shortfalls during recent humanitarian crises despite increased need. The global civil society addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as it monitors abuses and pressures governments, which is shown in Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reporting on abuses in Iran following protests in 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as authoritarian states suppress activism, which is shown in the arrest and restriction of human rights defenders in several countries since 2020. The global civil society addresses and resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as activist movements influence public opinion and policy, which is shown in global climate strikes inspired by youth activists continuing after 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as governments and corporations can resist pressure, which is shown in global emissions continuing to rise despite sustained environmental campaigning. Non-state actors address and resolve global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as humanitarian organizations and mediators provide relief and support peace efforts, which is shown in NGOs delivering aid and documenting war crimes during the Ukraine conflict since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as non-state actors lack coercive power, which is shown in the continuation of armed conflict despite sustained NGO involvement in Ukraine. Non-state actors of justice address and resolve global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as charities, courts of public opinion, and advocacy groups influence policy and provide direct assistance, which is shown in international NGOs expanding food and poverty relief programs during the global cost of living crisis since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as efforts depend on voluntary funding and cooperation, which is shown in funding shortages limiting aid delivery during recent humanitarian crises. Non-state actors of justice address and resolve global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as they investigate abuses and pressure governments through legal advocacy, which is shown in Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reporting on state repression in Iran following the 2022 protests. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as authoritarian regimes restrict civil society activity, which is shown in the detention and harassment of human rights defenders in multiple states since 2020. Non-state actors of justice address and resolve global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as activist movements and legal campaigners influence public awareness and policy change, which is shown in strategic climate litigation supported by NGOs across Europe since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as governments and corporations can resist non-binding pressure, which is shown in continued global emissions growth despite sustained environmental activism. Non-governmental organizations address and resolve global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as they provide humanitarian aid, mediation support, and protection for civilians, which is shown in NGOs such as the Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières delivering emergency assistance during the war in Ukraine since 2022. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as NGOs have limited power to enforce peace or stop violence, which is shown in the continuation of armed conflict in Ukraine despite sustained NGO involvement. Non-governmental organizations address and resolve global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as they deliver direct aid and influence development policy, which is shown in NGOs expanding food security and income support programs during the global cost of living crisis since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as NGO programs rely heavily on donations and state access, which is shown in reduced aid provision following funding shortfalls in major humanitarian appeals in recent years. Non-governmental organizations address and resolve global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as they monitor abuses and apply international pressure through reporting and advocacy, which is shown in Amnesty International documenting human rights violations during protests in Iran from 2022 onwards. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as governments can restrict or expel NGOs, which is shown in the tightening of laws on foreign-funded organizations in several states since 2020. Non-governmental organizations address and resolve global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as they raise awareness and pursue legal and policy change, which is shown in NGO-supported climate campaigns influencing stronger emissions targets in several European countries since 2020. However, it may address and resolve these issues to a lesser extent as environmental protection depends on state enforcement and economic priorities, which is shown in continued deforestation and rising global emissions despite sustained NGO activism. Global powers and developments refer to the ways states use their influence and evolving political, economic, and technological capacities to shape how global issues are addressed and resolved. The different types of political power that can be used by states are soft and hard. Hard power is the use of the military and economic policy to influence other political bodies. Hard power is used as a means of forcing compliance by threatening or applying military action or economic sanctions. An example of this is Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, where military force was used to achieve political objectives. The use of hard power is effective as it can influence other states quickly, deters other states from opposing through fear, and demonstrates credibility and the ability to find and enact solutions. This is shown in the US-led military campaign against ISIS by 2017, which significantly reduced the group's territorial control through sustained force. However, the use of hard power is ineffective as it can provoke resistance, can damage the state's reputation, and can be costly in lives and resources. This is shown in the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, where prolonged military involvement failed to create lasting political stability. Soft power is the ability to shape the preferences of others using diplomatic and cultural techniques. Soft power is used as a way of building cooperation and legitimacy by promoting values, culture, and positive international relationships. An example of this is the United States rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement in 2021, where diplomacy was used to influence other states to cooperate. The use of soft power is effective as it can build cooperation, improves the state's reputation, is less costly, and can create sustainable influence. This is shown in the European Union's diplomatic unity and cultural influence used to coordinate international support for Ukraine since 2022. However, the use of soft power may be ineffective as it's slower, can be ignored, and cannot be enforced. This is shown in China's use of Confucius Institutes over the last decade, where concerns over political influence have led some countries to close them. State power is classified as the level of influence and capability a state has to shape international outcomes and global decision-making. The different classifications of state power are great powers, superpowers, and emerging powers, based on their military, economic, and diplomatic influence. Great powers are states with substantial military strength, large economies, and significant diplomatic influence, but without total global dominance. An example of a state with great powers is the United Kingdom, as it has a strong military, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and major diplomatic reach. Great power states are significant in global affairs as they shape international law, influence global security, and play leading roles in international organizations. This is shown in the UK and France coordinating diplomatic and military support for Ukraine since 2022. However, great power states may not be significant as their influence can be constrained by economic decline, reliance on alliances, and competition from stronger states. This is shown in the UK's reduced global influence following Brexit negotiations from 2016 onwards. Superpowers are states with overwhelming military, economic, and cultural influence that allows them to project power on a global scale. An example of a state with superpowers is the United States, as it has the world's largest economy, extensive military bases worldwide, and strong cultural influence. Superpower states are significant in global affairs as they dominate international security, shape global economic systems, and influence international norms and values. This is shown in the United States leading NATO support for Ukraine following Russia's invasion in 2022. However, superpower states may not be significant as they face overstretch, domestic political division, and growing resistance from rival states. This is shown in the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, which highlighted limits to long-term military influence. Emerging powers are states whose economic and political influence is rapidly increasing but is not yet fully established globally. An example of a state with emerging powers is India, as it has fast economic growth, a large population, and increasing regional and global influence. Emerging power states are significant in global affairs as they reshape global economic patterns, influence regional stability, and challenge existing power structures. This is shown in India's expanding role in the G20, including hosting the summit in 2023. However, emerging power states may not be significant as they often face internal inequality, limited military reach, and dependence on existing global systems. This is shown in Brazil's economic instability since 2016, which has limited its ability to sustain global influence. Polarity is the way power is distributed across the international system between states. There are three different polar structures, which are unipolarity, bipolarity, and multipolarity. Unipolarity, or hegemony, is where a single state holds a dominant position in military, economic, and political power. The implications of a state having a unipolarity structure are greater global influence, the ability to shape international institutions, and responsibility for maintaining global stability. An example of a unipolarity state is the United States, as it has unmatched military reach, economic influence, and cultural power on a global scale. Bipolarity is where power is concentrated between two dominant states that compete for influence. The implications of a state having a bipolarity structure are increased rivalry, clearer alliance systems, and a higher risk of tension between the two leading powers. An example of a bipolarity state is the United States and China, as both dominate global trade, military capability, and political influence while competing directly with each other. Multipolarity is where power is spread across several significant states rather than concentrated in one or two. The implications of a state having a multipolarity structure are greater cooperation, more complex alliances, and increased uncertainty in global decision-making. An example of a multipolarity state is the European Union, as its collective economic strength and diplomatic influence rival other major global powers. World order is the overall structure of relationships between states where power, rules, and institutions shape how countries interact, cooperate, and resolve conflict at the international level. The nature of world order has changed since 2000 as power has become more dispersed among emerging and regional powers. This is shown in the growing influence of China through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative over the last decade. However, the nature of world order has not changed since 2000 as the United States remains the most dominant global military and economic power. This is shown in the United States leading international sanctions and military support for Ukraine since 2022. There are many different systems of government, including democratic, semi-democratic, non-democratic, autocratic states, failed states, and rogue states, which shape how states interact within global order. A democratic government is a system where political power is derived from the people through free and fair elections. The characteristics of a democratic government are regular elections, the rule of law, protection of human rights, separation of powers, an independent judiciary, and freedom of the media. An example of a democratic government is Germany, as it holds competitive elections, protects civil liberties, and operates under a strong constitutional framework. The positive impact of democratic states on global order is the promotion of cooperation, stability, and international law, which is shown in Germany's leadership role within the European Union during the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine since 2022. However, a negative impact of democratic states on global order is policy inconsistency caused by electoral change, which is shown in the United States shifting foreign policy priorities between administrations over the last decade. A semi-democratic government is a system where elections exist but democratic freedoms and checks on power are limited. The characteristics of a semi-democratic government are restricted media freedom, weakened judicial independence, regular but flawed elections, limits on opposition parties, and concentration of executive power. An example of a semi-democratic government is Hungary, as it holds elections but has reduced media freedom and weakened checks on executive authority. The positive impact of semi-democratic states on global order is their ability to provide regional stability and economic cooperation, which is shown in Hungary's continued participation in European Union decision-making since 2015. However, a negative impact of semi-democratic states on global order is the erosion of democratic norms, which is shown in European Union disputes with Hungary over rule of law concerns since 2018. A non-democratic government is a system where political power is not gained through free and fair elections and public participation is limited. The characteristics of a non-democratic government are one-party rule, limited political freedoms, state control of the media, repression of opposition, and weak accountability. An example of a non-democratic government is China, as political power is controlled by a single party and opposition is not permitted. The positive impact of non-democratic states on global order is their capacity for rapid decision-making and economic coordination, which is shown in China's large-scale infrastructure investment through the Belt and Road Initiative over the last decade. However, a negative impact of non-democratic states on global order is the undermining of human rights and international norms, which is shown in international criticism of China's actions in Xinjiang since 2017. An autocratic government is a system where power is concentrated in the hands of a single leader or a small elite. The characteristics of an autocratic government are limited political participation, strong control over the media, repression of dissent, weak legislative oversight, and long-term leadership. An example of an autocratic government is Russia, as political power is centralized under President Putin and opposition is heavily restricted. The positive impact of autocratic states on global order is the ability to act decisively in foreign policy, which is shown in Russia's rapid military mobilization in Syria prior to 2016. However, a negative impact of autocratic states on global order is increased instability and conflict, which is shown in Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. A failed state is a state where the government has lost effective control over its territory and cannot provide basic services. The characteristics of a failed state are weak central authority, widespread violence, economic collapse, lack of public services, and humanitarian crises. An example of a failed state is Somalia, as its government has struggled to control territory and provide security since the collapse of central authority. The positive impact of failed states on global order is increased international cooperation in humanitarian intervention, which is shown in United Nations and African Union peacekeeping efforts in Somalia since 2016. However, a negative impact of failed states on global order is the spread of terrorism and regional instability, which is shown in ongoing attacks by al-Shabaab in East Africa over the last decade. A rogue state is a state that is perceived to threaten international peace by violating international law and norms. The characteristics of a rogue state are pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, defiance of international agreements, aggressive foreign policy, isolation from the international community, and heavy sanctions. An example of a rogue state is North Korea, as it continues to develop nuclear weapons in defiance of United Nations resolutions. The positive impact of rogue states on global order is increased international cooperation among other states to contain threats, which is shown in coordinated United Nations sanctions against North Korea since 2016. However, a negative impact of rogue states on global order is heightened global insecurity, which is shown in North Korea's repeated missile tests since 2017. Liberal economies, the rule of law, and democracy have developed over time and spread across the global political system. Liberal economies are economic systems where market forces, private ownership, and competition largely determine the production and distribution of goods and services. Liberal economies have developed by evolving through historical stages linked to changes in trade, industry, and state intervention. Liberal economies first developed by the growth of free trade and limited government involvement during early industrialization. Liberal economies then developed by expanding global trade networks and financial systems during the 20th century. Liberal economies later developed by adapting to globalization through deregulation, technological innovation, and international economic institutions. Liberal economies have spread across the globe as states adopt free markets to encourage growth, investment, and integration into the global economy. This is shown in the United Kingdom joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2023 to expand free trade links. Rule of law is the principle that all individuals and institutions are subject to and accountable under the law, applied equally and fairly. Rule of law has developed by progressing through stages that strengthened legal limits on power and protected individual rights. Rule of law first developed by establishing legal codes that restricted arbitrary rule by monarchs or elites. Rule of law then developed by creating independent courts and legal procedures to enforce laws consistently. Rule of law later developed by embedding human rights protections into national constitutions and international law. Rule of law have spread across the globe as international institutions and agreements promote legal standards and accountability. This is shown in the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants related to the Ukraine conflict in 2023, reinforcing international legal norms. Democracy is a system of government where political authority comes from the people through participation and representation. Democracy has developed by advancing through stages that expanded political rights and accountability. Democracy first developed by extending voting rights beyond elites to wider sections of society. Democracy then developed by strengthening representative institutions and competitive political parties. Democracy later developed by protecting civil liberties and ensuring free media and independent oversight. Democracy has spread across the globe as international pressure, education, and institutions encourage popular participation in government. This is shown in Ukraine being granted European Union candidate status in 2022 due to commitments to democratic reforms and governance standards. There are many ways the changing relationships and actions of states address global issues involving conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment. The changing relationships of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving conflict by forming alliances and collective security arrangements to deter aggression and coordinate responses. The changing relationships of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving conflict by using international institutions, diplomacy, and shared norms to manage disputes peacefully. This resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as collective action increases deterrence and legitimacy, which is shown in NATO coordinating military support for Ukraine following Russia's invasion in 2022. However, this resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as diplomatic cooperation reduces escalation and encourages negotiation, which is shown in United Nations-led ceasefire efforts during the Israel-Gaza conflict since 2023. The changing relationships of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving poverty by using influence within international organizations to coordinate aid, debt relief, and development priorities. The changing relationships of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving poverty by strengthening cooperation through global institutions, shared targets, and multilateral agreements. This resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as coordinated international action increases funding and support for the poorest states, which is shown in the World Bank approving a record replenishment of the International Development Association in 2021 to support low-income countries after COVID. However, this resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as collective debt management prevents economic collapse and allows states to invest in development, which is shown in the G20 Common Framework for Debt Relief introduced in 2020 for heavily indebted countries. The changing relationships of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving human rights by using diplomatic influence and alliances to pressure states to comply with international standards. The changing relationships of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving human rights by strengthening international institutions, treaties, and shared norms. This resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as collective pressure increases accountability and legitimacy, which is shown in coordinated Western sanctions against Russian officials for human rights abuses in Ukraine since 2022. However, this resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as dialogue and engagement encourage gradual reform, which is shown in renewed United Nations human rights monitoring in Afghanistan since 2021. The changing relationships of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving the environment by forming international agreements where powerful states set targets and influence collective action. The changing relationships of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving the environment by increasing cooperation through global institutions, scientific sharing, and environmental diplomacy. This resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as collective commitments encourage coordinated reductions in emissions, which is shown in countries strengthening climate pledges at COP26 in 2021. However, this resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as flexible cooperation allows states at different stages of development to participate, which is shown in the Paris Agreement being reaffirmed and expanded upon by most states since 2015. The changing actions of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving conflict by using military intervention, sanctions, and deterrence to influence the behavior of other states. The changing actions of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving conflict by prioritizing mediation, peacekeeping, and humanitarian assistance alongside force. This resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as decisive action can limit further violence and weaken aggressors, which is shown in international sanctions imposed on Russia since 2022. However, this resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as long-term stability is built through negotiation and reconstruction, which is shown in African Union and United Nations peacekeeping operations in Mali during the last decade. The changing actions of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving poverty by using economic strength to provide aid, investment, and preferential trade access. The changing actions of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving poverty by focusing on long-term development through education, infrastructure, and sustainable growth policies. This resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as targeted investment stimulates growth and job creation, which is shown in China's Belt and Road projects contributing to poverty reduction in parts of Asia and Africa during the last decade. However, this resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as direct humanitarian assistance protects vulnerable populations during crises, which is shown in international emergency aid provided to countries facing food insecurity following the COVID pandemic since 2020. The changing actions of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving human rights by imposing sanctions, withdrawing aid, or using conditional trade to influence behavior. The changing actions of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving human rights by supporting civil society, monitoring abuses, and promoting legal reform. This resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as targeted measures deter abuses and support victims, which is shown in the United States using the Global Magnitsky Act to sanction individuals responsible for abuses since 2017. However, this resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as long-term protection depends on institutional reform rather than punishment alone, which is shown in European Union-funded rule of law and human rights programs in the Western Balkans over the last decade. The changing actions of states, in relation to power, address and resolve global issues involving the environment by using economic influence, sanctions, and investment to shape environmental behavior. The changing actions of states, in relation to developments, address and resolve global issues involving the environment by investing in renewable energy, green technology, and sustainable development policies. This resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as state-led investment accelerates the transition away from fossil fuels, which is shown in the European Union expanding its Green Deal policies since 2019. However, this resolves global issues involving the environment to a greater extent as long-term progress depends on domestic policy change rather than pressure alone, which is shown in China increasing renewable energy capacity and reducing coal growth since 2020. Regionalism refers to cooperation between states within a specific geographical area, and the European Union is a key example where European states have integrated economically and politically to pursue shared interests. Regionalism is the process where states within a particular geographical area cooperate more closely on economic, political, or security matters to pursue shared interests. Regionalism has grown by increasing formal cooperation between neighboring states through regional organizations, treaties, and institutions responding to global economic and security pressures. This is shown by the creation of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in 2020, where 15 Asia-Pacific countries formed the world's largest free trade agreement. The different forms of regionalism are economic regionalism, security regionalism, and political regionalism. Economic regionalism is cooperation between states to reduce trade barriers and integrate markets within a specific region. Economic regionalism has developed by the expansion of regional trade agreements such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, which began trading in 2021. Security regionalism is cooperation between states to address shared security threats through alliances and defense agreements. Security regionalism has developed by NATO strengthening collective defense following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Political regionalism is the transfer or sharing of political authority and decision-making between states at a regional level. Political has developed by increased cooperation within the European Union on climate policy and sanctions policy during the 2020s. The relationship between regionalism and globalization is that regionalism can complement globalization by managing its effects through regional frameworks. This is shown by regional supply chain cooperation during the COVID-19 pandemic between 2020 and 2022 to manage global economic disruption. The prospects of political regionalism are moderate but uneven due to differing national interests and levels of political integration. This is shown by ongoing debates over deeper EU integration following the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union in 2020. The prospects of regional governance are increasing as states seek collective solutions to transnational issues such as climate change and migration. This is shown by the European Union's coordinated response to the energy crisis following Russia's actions in Ukraine from 2022 onwards. The impact of regionalism on state sovereignty is that it can limit independent decision-making while enhancing collective influence. This is shown by EU member states being required to follow common trade and competition rules throughout the 2010s and 2020s. The debates that regionalism is beneficial are that it promotes economic growth, enhances security cooperation, and increases political influence on the global stage. This is shown by ASEAN states increasing economic resilience through regional trade cooperation during global trade tensions after 2018. The debates that regionalism is not beneficial are that it reduces sovereignty, creates unequal benefits between states, and can exclude non-members. This is shown by disagreements within the European Union over migration policy during the 2015 to 2023 period. Regionalism is significant as it shapes global trade patterns, influences security alliances, and provides regional solutions to global problems. This is shown by the growing importance of regional trade blocs like RCEP in global commerce since 2020. However, regionalism is not significant as global institutions remain influential, national interests often dominate, and regional cooperation can be fragmented. This is shown by the continued central role of the United Nations and the World Trade Organization in managing international crises during the 2020s. Regional organizations are formal institutions where states within the same geographical area cooperate to achieve shared economic, political, or security objectives. The North American Free Trade Association is a regional economic organization established to promote free trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. This has been developed by progressing through limited stages of economic integration rather than full political or economic union. The first stage of development is a free trade area where member states remove tariffs on most goods traded between them while keeping independent trade policies with non-members. The second stage of development is a deeper free trade framework where rules on investment, labor mobility, and dispute resolution were coordinated under the later USMCA agreement. The African Union is a regional political organization aiming to promote unity, peace, security, and development across the African continent. This has been developed by evolving from economic cooperation towards greater political and institutional integration. The first stage of development is a free trade area pursued through the African Continental Free Trade Area to reduce tariffs between African states. The second stage of development is movement towards a customs union where African states aim to coordinate external trade policies. The third stage of development is a proposed economic and political union where shared institutions are intended to manage continental governance. The Arab League is a regional political organization formed to promote cooperation and protect the sovereignty of Arab states. This has been developed by maintaining a loose structure that prioritizes state sovereignty over deep integration. The first stage of development is political cooperation where member states consult on shared regional issues without binding authority. The second stage of development is limited economic cooperation through agreements that encourage coordination rather than full integration. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is a regional organization focused on economic growth, political stability, and regional cooperation in Southeast Asia. This has been developed by gradually deepening economic and political cooperation while avoiding supranational control. The first stage of development is a free trade area established through the ASEAN Free Trade Area to reduce tariffs between members. The second stage of development is an emerging common market where there is increased movement of goods, services, and skilled labor across the region. The third stage of development is limited political cooperation where decisions are made through consensus rather than binding regional authority. European integration is the process where European states cooperate more closely by pooling sovereignty and developing shared institutions, laws, and policies to promote peace, stability, and economic cooperation across Europe. The factors that have fostered European integration are the desire to prevent conflict, economic cooperation, political cooperation, and global influence. The desire to prevent conflict means avoiding another major European war, which led to European integration by encouraging states to pool sovereignty after the Second World War to make war between members unlikely. Economic cooperation means states working together to increase trade and prosperity, which led to European integration by creating shared markets such as the European Coal and Steel Community. Political cooperation means governments coordinating policies and values, which led to European integration by encouraging joint decision-making on issues such as human rights and democracy. Global influence means increasing collective power on the world stage, which led to European integration by allowing European states to negotiate and act together internationally. The European Union was formed as a political and economic partnership to promote peace, stability, and cooperation between European states. The role of the European Union is to coordinate policy, create common laws, and manage shared areas such as trade, competition, and the single market. The objectives of the European Union are to promote peace, economic growth, social progress, free movement, and respect for fundamental rights. The European Union was developed by gradual integration through treaties agreed by member states. The first stage of development was the European Coal and Steel Community, which integrated key industries to reduce the risk of war. The second stage of development was the European Economic Community, which created a common market to encourage free trade and economic growth. The third stage of development was the European Union, which expanded cooperation into political, social, and monetary areas. The key institutions of the European Union are the European Commission, the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, the European Council, and the Court of Justice of the European Union. The European Commission was established by the founding treaties and has the power to propose legislation, enforce EU law, and represent the EU internationally. The European Parliament was established to represent EU citizens and has the power to amend, approve, and reject EU legislation and budgets. The Council of the European Union was established to represent member state governments and has the power to negotiate and pass laws with the European Parliament. The European Council was established to provide political direction and sets the overall priorities of the European Union. The Court of Justice of the European Union was established to ensure EU law is applied equally and has the power to interpret treaties and rule against member states. The process of enlargement is the method where new countries join the European Union after meeting strict political and economic criteria. This affects the European Union as it increases its size, diversity, and global influence while also creating challenges for decision-making. The key treaties and agreements of the European Union are the Treaty of Rome, the Maastricht Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, and the Schengen Agreement. The Treaty of Rome is the founding treaty signed in 1957 that created the European Economic Community and established a common market to allow free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor between member states. The Maastricht Treaty is the 1992 treaty that formally created the European Union and expanded integration by introducing European citizenship, increasing cooperation in foreign and security policy, and setting out plans for the economic and monetary union. The Lisbon Treaty is the 2007 treaty that reformed the structure of the European Union by strengthening the powers of the European Parliament, creating a permanent president of the European Council, and improving decision-making efficiency. The Schengen Agreement is an agreement that removed internal border controls between participating European states, allowing people to travel freely without passport checks across much of Europe. The Economic and Monetary Union is the framework where EU states coordinate economic policy and many share a single currency, the euro. Supranationalism is where decision-making power is shared with independent EU institutions rather than being controlled solely by member states. Supranational approaches are used by the EU as policy is made above the national level, which is shown by the European Commission enforcing competition fines on major technology companies such as Google in the last decade. The debates that supranational approaches are effective are that they ensure consistent laws, prevent domination by powerful states, and allow swift collective action. This is shown by the EU vaccine procurement program during the COVID-19 pandemic, where the European Commission negotiated on behalf of all member states. However, the debates that supranational approaches are not effective are that they reduce national sovereignty, create democratic deficits, and are slow and bureaucratic. This is shown by criticism of EU decision-making during the early stages of the COVID-19 response, where some states felt constrained by central coordination. Intergovernmentalism is where power remains primarily with member states and decisions are made through negotiation between governments. Intergovernmental approaches are used by the EU as states retain control over sensitive areas, which is shown in EU foreign policy decisions requiring unanimous agreement. The debates that intergovernmental approaches are effective are that they protect sovereignty, increase democratic legitimacy, and allow flexibility for national interests. This is shown by coordinated EU sanctions on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, where member states agreed measures through collective negotiation. However, the debates that intergovernmental approaches are not effective are that they lead to slow decision-making, watered-down policies, and deadlock. This is shown by delays and disagreements between member states over migration policy reform within the last decade. An international body is an organization created by states to facilitate cooperation between them, whereas a global actor is an entity able to independently influence outcomes in global politics. The European Union is significant as an international body as it provides a forum for cooperation, creates binding rules for members, and coordinates collective responses to shared challenges. This is shown by the European Union coordinating collective sanctions against Russia following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. However, the European Union is not significant as an international body as internal divisions weaken unity, decision-making can be slow, and national governments retain key powers. This is shown by disagreements between member states over migration policy during the refugee pressures of the late 2010s and early 2020s. The European Union is significant as a global actor as it has major economic power, regulatory influence, and diplomatic reach. This is shown by the European Union shaping global digital regulation through the implementation of the General Data Protection Regulation from 2018 onwards. However, the European Union is not significant as a global actor as it lacks a unified foreign policy, has limited military capacity, and is constrained by competing national interests. This is shown by differing EU member state responses to the Israel-Gaza conflict since 2023. The constraints and obstacles that affect the European Union's political influence in global politics are the requirement for consensus, national sovereignty concerns, and divergent foreign policy priorities. This is shown by delays and compromises in agreeing common foreign policy positions on China during the 2020s. The constraints and obstacles that affect the European Union's economic influence in global politics are uneven economic performance, reliance on external energy supplies, and global competition. This is shown by the impact of the 2022 energy crisis on EU economies following reduced gas supplies from Russia. The constraints and obstacles that affect the European Union's structural influence in global politics are institutional complexity, democratic legitimacy concerns, and limited enforcement capacity beyond its borders. This is shown by challenges in enforcing EU environmental standards on external trading partners during negotiations in the early 2020s. The constraints and obstacles that affect the European Union's military influence in global politics are limited defense integration, dependence on NATO, and uneven military spending among members. This is shown by the European Union relying heavily on NATO rather than independent military action in response to the war in Ukraine since 2022. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict by encouraging cooperation between neighboring states through mediation, peacekeeping, and collective security arrangements. This is shown by the African Union supporting peacekeeping and mediation efforts in Ethiopia during the Tigray conflict from 2020 onwards. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a greater extent as regional organizations often have better local knowledge and legitimacy than global institutions. This is shown by ECOWAS mediating political crises and attempting conflict resolution following military coups in Mali and Niger between 2020 and 2023. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving conflict to a lesser extent as regional organizations frequently lack enforcement power and are constrained by member state interests. This is shown by the Arab League's limited ability to end the Syrian conflict despite continued engagement during the 2010s and 2020s. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty by promoting regional trade, development funds, and economic cooperation to support growth. This is shown by the European Union providing large-scale development funding to Eastern and Southern European regions through cohesion policy since 2015. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a greater extent as coordinated regional development reduces inequality and encourages sustainable growth. This is shown by the African Continental Free Trade Area beginning implementation in 2021 to boost intra-African trade and economic development. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving poverty to a lesser extent as economic benefits are often unevenly distributed between member states. This is shown by persistent economic disparities between southern and northern EU member states following the Eurozone crisis during the late 2010s. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights by setting regional standards and monitoring state compliance. This is shown by the European Union imposing sanctions on Belarusian officials over human rights abuses since 2020. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a greater extent as regional courts and agreements can directly influence member state behavior. This is shown by rulings of the European Court of Human Rights continuing to shape national laws across Europe during the 2010s and 2020s. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving human rights to a lesser extent as enforcement mechanisms are weak and states may ignore rulings. This is shown by continued human rights concerns in Hungary and Poland despite EU pressure since 2018. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving military influence by forming collective defense alliances that deter aggression. This is shown by NATO strengthening its eastern presence following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving military influence to a greater extent as collective security increases deterrence and burden sharing. This is shown by Finland and Sweden seeking NATO membership in response to regional security threats in 2022 and 2023. Regionalism addresses and resolves global issues involving military influence to a lesser extent as regional alliances can escalate tensions and exclude non-members. This is shown by increased geopolitical tensions between NATO and Russia since 2022. Comparative theories. A comparative theory is an approach used to compare and evaluate different theories in order to understand their similarities, differences, strengths, and weaknesses in explaining global politics. The main ideas of realism. Realism is a theory of international relations that focuses on power, national interest, and the role of the state in an anarchic international system. The main ideas of realism are states as key actors in global politics and the balance of power through state sovereignty, international anarchy and its implications, the inevitability of war, and the security dilemma. States as key actors in global politics and the balance of power through state sovereignty means that states are the most important actors in international relations and act independently to protect their own interests and power. International anarchy and its implications means that there is no central authority above states, which leads to uncertainty, competition, and a reliance on self-help for security. The inevitability of war means that conflict is seen as unavoidable due to competing interests, mistrust, and the struggle for power between states. The security dilemma means that when one state increases its security, it can make other states feel less secure, leading to tension and potential conflict. The main ideas of liberalism. Liberalism is a theory of international relations that emphasizes cooperation, shared values, and the potential for peace through institutions and interdependence. The main ideas of liberalism are the significance of morality and optimism on human nature, the possibility of harmony and balance, complex interdependence, the likelihood of global governance, and the impact and growth of international organizations. The significance of morality and optimism on human nature means that individuals and states are capable of acting ethically and cooperatively rather than purely in self-interest. The possibility of harmony and balance means that conflict is not inevitable and that cooperation can lead to stable and peaceful international relations. Complex interdependence means that states are connected through economic, political, and social ties, making cooperation more beneficial than conflict. The likelihood of global governance means that international rules, norms, and institutions can manage global issues and reduce conflict between states. The impact and growth of international organizations means that bodies such as the United Nations play an increasingly important role in promoting cooperation, peace, and collective problem solving. Divisions between realism and liberalism. The ideas of realism and liberalism are divided as fundamentally different approaches to understanding how international politics operates and how states behave. These ideas are divided by human nature and power, order and security and the likelihood of conflict, and the impact of international organizations and the significance of states. The ideas of realism and liberalism are divided by human nature and power as realism views humans and states as self-interested and power-seeking, whereas liberalism sees them as capable of cooperation and moral behavior. The ideas of realism and liberalism are divided by order and security, as realism prioritizes state security through power and self-help, while liberalism emphasizes cooperation and rules to maintain order. The ideas of realism and liberalism are divided by the likelihood of conflict, as realism considers conflict inevitable due to competition and mistrust, whereas liberalism believes conflict can be reduced through cooperation and institutions. The ideas of realism and liberalism are divided by the impact of organizations, as realism views international organizations as weak and dependent on states, while liberalism sees them as influential in promoting cooperation and peace. The ideas of realism and liberalism are divided by the significance of states, as realism treats states as the most important actors in global politics, whereas liberalism recognizes the growing importance of non-state actors alongside states. Anarchical society and society of states. An anarchical society is a system of states where there is no overarching authority above them, meaning states operate independently in global politics. Whereas a society of states is a group of sovereign states that recognize common rules, norms, and institutions that guide their interactions. Anarchical society. The main ideas of an anarchical society are the absence of a central authority, state sovereignty, self-help, and the balance of power. The absence of a central authority means there is no global government capable of enforcing rules or laws on all states. State sovereignty means that each state has supreme authority over its own territory and is legally equal to other states. Self-help means that states are responsible for their own security and survival because they cannot rely on others for protection. The balance of power means that states seek to prevent any one state from becoming too powerful by forming alliances or increasing their own capabilities. An example of an anarchical society is the international system during the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union operated without a global authority above them. The view that there must be acceptance that there is anarchy in the global system is based on the understanding that no higher authority exists above states. This acceptance shapes how states behave, as they must prioritize their own security and interests. As a result, cooperation is often cautious and driven by self-interest rather than trust alone. Society of states. The main ideas of a society of states are shared norms and rules, mutual recognition of sovereignty, diplomacy, and cooperation through institutions. Shared norms and rules mean that states follow accepted standards of behavior, such as respecting borders and honoring agreements. Mutual recognition of sovereignty means that states accept each other as legitimate and legally equal members of international society. Diplomacy means that states manage their relationships through communication, negotiation, and dialogue rather than force alone. Cooperation through institutions means that states work together within organizations to address shared problems and maintain order. An example of a society of states is the European Union, where member states cooperate through shared rules, institutions, and norms. The view that states have an informal understanding that ensures a degree of cooperation is based on shared expectations about acceptable behavior. These norms and rules increase trust by encouraging predictable and reciprocal actions between states. Over time, this cooperation reduces uncertainty and helps maintain stability even without a formal global authority. Extent of realism and liberalism. The theory of realism explains recent developments in global politics to a greater extent as it emphasizes power, state self-interest, and security concerns in an increasingly unstable international system. This is shown in Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, where military force was used to pursue national interests despite international law and opposition. However, the theory explains recent developments in global politics to a lesser extent as it underestimates the role of cooperation and international institutions. This is shown in the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic since 2020, where states coordinated through organizations such as the World Health Organization to manage a shared threat. The theory of liberalism explains recent developments in global politics to a greater extent as it highlights cooperation, interdependence, and the importance of international institutions in addressing global issues. This is shown in the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015, where states work together to tackle climate change through shared commitments and norms. However, the theory explains recent developments in global politics to a lesser extent as it overestimates the effectiveness of institutions and shared values. This is shown in the failure of the United Nations to prevent or resolve ongoing conflicts such as the war in Syria during the last decade. The State and Globalisation. Theories of the state and globalization help explain how power, sovereignty, and cooperation operate in modern global politics, particularly through realism and liberalism. From a realist perspective, recent developments since 2000 suggest that the state remains the central actor and that power politics continue to shape the international system. This is evident in events such as the United States-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 and Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, both of which demonstrate states using military force to pursue national interests despite international opposition. More recently, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 reinforces the realist view that global politics is defined by anarchy, competition, and the prioritization of security, where globalization has not removed the importance of sovereignty or the likelihood of conflict between states. However, liberalism explains recent developments to a significant extent by highlighting the impact of globalization, cooperation, and international institutions. Since 2000, economic interdependence has deepened through global trade networks, shown by the expansion of the World Trade Organization and the integration of global supply chains. Liberal ideas are also reflected in collective responses to global challenges, such as the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, where states cooperated to address climate change, and international coordination during the COVID-19 pandemic through organizations like the World Health Organization. Despite this, liberalism is limited where cooperation has broken down, such as the failure of international institutions to prevent conflicts in Syria or Ukraine, showing that while globalization encourages cooperation, state interests and power politics continue to constrain its effectiveness. Political and economic global governance. Theories of political and economic global governance examine how global rules, institutions, and power structures manage international relations, and these can be evaluated through realism and liberalism. From a realist perspective, recent developments since 2000 suggest that global governance is limited by state interests and power politics rather than genuine collective authority. This can be seen in the 2008 global financial crisis, where powerful states prioritized national economic stability through domestic bailouts rather than relying fully on global institutions, and in the United States' withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement in 2017, which demonstrated how states can disregard global commitments when they conflict with national interests. More recently, the use of economic sanctions by states against Russia following its invasion of Ukraine in 2022 highlights how economic governance tools are used strategically to advance state power rather than purely cooperative goals. However, liberalism explains political and economic global governance to a considerable extent by emphasizing cooperation, institutions, and interdependence. Since 2000, international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization have played key roles in managing economic globalization, including coordinating responses to financial instability and promoting trade rules. Political governance is also reflected in collective efforts to address global issues, such as the G20 coordinating economic recovery after the 2008 crisis and international cooperation on climate change through agreements like the Paris Climate Agreement. Despite these developments, liberalism is limited where global governance has failed to enforce compliance or prevent inequality, showing that while institutions facilitate cooperation, their effectiveness remains constrained by the continuing dominance of sovereign states. Human rights and environmental global governance. Theories of human rights global governance can be evaluated through realism and liberalism when assessing development since 2000. From a realist perspective, the protection of human rights remains secondary to state sovereignty and national interest, limiting the effectiveness of global governance. This is evident in China's treatment of the Uyghur population since the 2010s, where allegations of human rights abuses have continued despite international criticism, showing that powerful states can resist external pressure. Similarly, the failure of the international community to prevent widespread human rights violations during the Syrian civil war since 2011 highlights how the absence of enforcement mechanisms and competing state interests restrict the impact of human rights norms, supporting the realist view that power politics outweigh moral considerations. However, liberalism explains human rights and environmental global governance to a significant extent by emphasizing international law, institutions, and cooperation. Since 2000, the expansion of international human rights frameworks, such as the International Criminal Court prosecuting individuals for crimes against humanity, reflects liberal beliefs in accountability beyond the state. Environmental global governance also supports liberalism, particularly through collective action on climate change, shown by the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, where states committed to reducing emissions through shared rules and transparency. Despite this, liberalism is limited where compliance is weak, such as continued global rises in emissions and selective adherence to human rights obligations, demonstrating that while institutions promote cooperation, their effectiveness is constrained by state interests and unequal power. Power and developments. Theories of power in global politics can be analyzed through realism, which argues that states seek to maximize power and security in an anarchic international system. Since 2000, realist ideas strongly explain developments where military and economic power have been used to advance national interests. This is evident in the United States' invasion of Iraq in 2003, which demonstrated the use of hard power to reshape regional security, and in Russia's increasing use of military force, shown by the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The rise of China as a major global power also supports realism, as its military expansion in the South China Sea and growing economic influence through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative reflect competition for power and influence rather than cooperation. However, liberalism explains developments in global politics by highlighting the role of soft power, institutions, and cooperation in shaping power relations. Since 2000, power has increasingly been exercised through international organizations and norms, such as the European Union, using economic and legal influence rather than military force to shape member state behavior. The growth of global institutions like the World Trade Organization has also shown how rules and interdependence can constrain state behavior and reduce conflict. Despite this, liberalism is limited where cooperation fails or is undermined by power politics, such as the inability of international institutions to prevent conflict in Ukraine or to manage rivalry between the United States and China, showing that while liberal mechanisms influence power, they do not replace the central role of the state. Regionalism and the EU. Theories of regionalism and the European Union can be evaluated through realism, which views regional organizations as arenas where states pursue national interests rather than surrendering sovereignty. Since 2000, realist ideas help explain developments where member states have prioritized national power and control over deeper integration. This is clearly shown by the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union following the 2016 referendum, where concerns over sovereignty, borders, and national decision-making outweighed the benefits of regional cooperation. The Eurozone debt crisis from 2009 also supports realism, as powerful states such as Germany exerted significant influence over economic decision-making, while national interests shaped responses to financial instability rather than equal solidarity across the Union. However, liberalism explains regionalism and the European Union to a considerable extent by emphasizing cooperation, shared values, and institutional governance. Since 2000, the European Union has expanded its role in economic, political, and legal integration, shown by the introduction of the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, which strengthened supranational institutions and increased cooperation between member states. Liberalism is also supported by collective EU responses to challenges such as climate change, where coordinated policies and shared regulations aim to reduce emissions across the region. Despite this, liberalism is limited where integration is resisted or fragmented, as seen in disagreements over migration policy and foreign relations, demonstrating that while the European Union reflects liberal principles of cooperation, national interests continue to shape its development. Thank you for watching this video on global politics. I'll see you in the next one.